You know how sometimes following a rule right down to the letter can lead to a result that just feels completely wrong? Or what about when the math used in our elections gets put under a microscope and questioned? Well, today we're diving into exactly that, how the Supreme Court steps in as the ultimate referee to untangle these kinds of messy legal knots.
Look, government agencies have to follow incredibly strict rules, especially when it's public money we're talking about. But every now and then, applying those rules creates a situation that is just fundamentally unfair. So, who gets to clean it up? Who has the final word on what's right? That's the big question we're tackling today. And as you'll see, the answer almost always leads right to the steps of the Supreme Court.
All right, let's get right into our first story. We're heading to the municipality of Mondragon, a town that was just hammered by Super Typhoon Yolanda. In the chaos that followed, the local officials tried to do something good for their employees. But that one act of goodwill ended up sparking a 7.7 million peso legal firestorm over what's truly fair.
And just get a load of that number, over 7.7 million pesos. Now, this wasn't money that was stolen or lost to corruption, not at all. This was money given out as special allowances to help municipal employees get back on their feet. But what looked like a compassionate, necessary thing to do was on a collision course with the cold, hard letter of the law.
And when you look at what this money was actually for, it really tells a story. You had economic crisis assistance, monetary augmentation to keep people away from loan sharks, agricultural crisis assistance because the typhoon wiped out crops, and even a mitigation allowance. I mean, these were benefits for public servants who were victims of the disaster themselves.
But then, the Commission on Audit, or COA, stepped in. They're the government's watchdog, and it's their job to make sure every single peso is spent by the book. And what they found was that these allowances, no matter how good the intentions were, technically violated the salary standardization law. So in a nutshell, COA declared the whole 7.7 million pesos illegal and said the money had to be returned.
And this is where the situation went from complicated to just plain unfair. COA's initial decision put the entire massive burden of repayment, all 7.7 million pesos, on the handful of officials who approved the payments. Meanwhile, the hundreds of employees who actually got the money, who spent it on food and repairs, they were let off the hook because they received it in good faith. Even the COA itself admitted this was, and I quote, perhaps an inequitable burden. So you have this completely lopsided situation, and that's when the Supreme Court intervened. Seeing this clear injustice, the court used this specific case, Madera v. COA, to do something huge. They didn't just solve this one town's problem. They created a whole new, much fairer standard for the entire government. Let's break down how they did it. The court dug into its legal toolbox and pulled out this old principle called solutio indebiti. Now, it sounds super complicated, I know, but the idea is actually incredibly simple. Think about it this way. If you're at a store and the cashier accidentally gives you an extra 100 pesos in change, you're supposed to give it back, right? That's solutio indebiti. The court said the same logic applies here. If you get a government payment by mistake, you generally have an obligation to return it.
So using that simple idea, they built a new, much more balanced system. First off, if you're an official who approved the payment and you genuinely thought it was legal, you acted in good faith, you're no longer on the hook. Second, only the officers who acted in bad faith or were grossly negligent have to pay. Third, the employees who got the money now have to return it, based on that simple principle of getting something by mistake. But, and this is crucial, the court added a fourth step. There can be exceptions for social justice or if returning the money would cause serious hardship. A way fairer system all around.
So we've seen how the court can untangle these messy financial knots. But this whole idea of making sure the rules are fair, it goes way beyond just money. The Supreme Court also has to step in and clarify the very rules that run our democracy. So let's pivot from paychecks to politics and look at another case that asks if the math behind our elections is actually fair. And that brings us to the next puzzle, Ankla v. Comelec. Okay, so the party list system is supposed to give a voice to groups that are often overlooked. But the formula for figuring out who gets a seat in Congress is, well, it's notoriously complicated. This case put that very math on trial, asking a really basic question. Is the system rigged to favor the biggest parties? Okay, so the fight really boiled down to this. On one side, you had the challengers. They argued that the formula was basically double counting the votes for the most popular parties, using them once to get their first seat and then using them again to grab even more seats. They said this violates the whole one person, one vote idea. But on the other side, the defense was that, no, there's no double counting going on. The votes are counted one time, and that same set of data is just used in a two-step process to fill all the seats. So, what was the verdict? Well, the Supreme Court actually sided with the existing system, and the reasoning is pretty fascinating. First, they said, nope, there's no double counting. But more importantly, they made a really key point. Our Constitution aims for a proportional system, but it doesn't demand perfect, absolute mathematical proportionality. The court basically said that Congress has a lot of room to design these systems, and that things like the 3-seat cap are already in place to stop any one group from getting too powerful. So the old formula from the Bonnet case stands. All right, let's step back and bring these two stories together. We've got a case about disaster relief for a small town, and another about the super complex math of our national politics. On the surface, they seem like they're from different planets, right? But they're actually connected by one single mission. The Supreme Court's job to make sure our rules are not just legal on paper, but that they're also fair and workable in the real world. I mean, just listen to this quote again. This is the government's own auditing agency, the COA, admitting that its own ruling created an inequitable burden. That's huge. That admission is basically the smoking gun that shows exactly why the Supreme Court had to get involved. Because here was a situation where following the law to a T created a result that was just plain wrong.
And really, that's the bottom line here. It's so crucial to understand this. In the Mondragon case, the court had to step in and literally create new rules to fix a clear injustice. But in the party list case, it chose to defend the existing rules, saying they were a good enough, functional compromise. This really shows you the court's two big jobs. Sometimes it's an architect, building a new framework, and sometimes it's a guardian, protecting the one we already have. But the goal is always the same, a just and workable outcome.
So all of this leaves us with a really profound question, doesn't it? The words written down in a law can't possibly predict every single real-world situation. So when should we prioritize what a law is meant to do, its spirit, over the exact, literal words on the page? That's the incredibly difficult balancing act the Supreme Court has to perform, and it's a question that's worth thinking about long after a case is closed.